Good morning and welcome to another App Marketing Conversations. As always, I'm joined by Ian Sefferman of Tune and Ryan Morel of GameHouse. I got it right, yeah?
You got it right?
Yeah. It's not like they've all
Until next week when it changes again.
We're coming up on the 1 year anniversary of the rebrand, so now it's like all combined. That's pretty good. In the previous segment, which I urge you to check out, we talked about DubDub, DC, and Google I/O, and some of the really interesting things that came out of that. And we thought it would make sense to dovetail that with some talk around some of the numbers in the ecosystem. There have been some updates. In particular, Benedict Evans of A16Z has been doing a phenomenal job sharing information specifically around the mobile ecosystem. So we want to talk about some of that stuff and what it means for the overall market and marketers and those foraying into the app business. So, a couple really high-level interesting things that I think he touches on to summarize are, number one, the change in the scale of consumer electronics and what it means from the perspective of like smartphones and tablets in particular is changing a lot of the economics of the tech business, right? Like I think his general thesis is this stuff is changing so fast at such a scale that we've never seen opportunities like this before, and as a result, industries are getting rebuilt and more opportunities being unlocked. I think that's one of the main points that he tries to underscore with really beautiful charts and graphs. Would you add anything to that?
So I think the secondary point that I would make that I don't think he's like outwardly talking about, but sort of, is how, since it changes so fast and how big the opportunities are, how much harder it is for marketers to gain traction and then maintain it over time, right? Because I think, because one of the stats, and we'll talk a little bit more about it, was how it was PCs, there's like 1 billion of them or something, and they get replaced every 5 to 7 years. But there's 4 billion phones and they get replaced every 2 years.
Yeah,
and it's kind of like a fresh start.
Actually, that's a great chart. So let's bring that up. Okay. So here's the chart we're talking about, right? And we'll put this in the link so you guys can look at this. But hopefully this is viewable on the screen. This is talking about the frequency with which people buy smartphones and what that looks like in terms of an absolute number basis. So every 2 years, about 4 billion people are buying new phones, as opposed to the PC replacement cycle, which was approximately 5 years, and every 5 years, about 1.6 billion PCs were being replaced. So that is a ton of stuff in the landfill, unfortunately. But it is really making that point about the acceleration, and really I think as app marketers, you start thinking about the fact that adoption paths that historically you might have thought about with PCs have shrunk pretty dramatically. Every 2 years you can assume people are getting like on not necessarily the latest and greatest hardware, but hardware that is pretty close to up to date.
Yeah. Well, the other kind of thing here that I hadn't really thought about was, since the actual hardware is improved at such a rapid clip, that means if you're building an app and it has any like relatively meaning, if you have customers who care, you constantly have to be building for the latest great hardware, where PCs, you didn't really have to do that. Right. Because a PC from 2010, if you wrote software for that, it still works.
Oh yeah.
It probably works better. Like,
there's still a lot of vendors that are totally comfortable supporting XP and Windows 2000, and they're like, yeah, we do that, and most of our install base is still on those things.
Yeah, and the corollary to that is that every 2 years we get more and more sensors, and Ben Evans talks about sensors, right? And sensors unlock opportunity for marketers and developers, and the more sensors we have, the more opportunity there is, and just like it's proliferating at a much quicker speed than it ever could have in the PC world.
Yeah, and I think again I would refer back to our previous video about DubDub versus Google I/O and sensors and privacy being like totally, they're intertwined in terms of strategy and things like that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, so because I guess the other that I hadn't thought about this either is, as you add things to your app based on what's available from a hardware and software perspective, you're also building lock-in, right? So like just the little things that people. So I've been thinking about Touch ID lately and just how good I found it to be. Like Chase Bank just finally added Touch ID, and now I love Chase Bank for some reason, right? Like, but developers have those opportunities to add API access to hardware that they didn't have otherwise, that gives consumers another reason to engage with them and build more lock-in, which I think is interesting.
I think one of the challenges of this graph is sort of, as a marketer, understanding how to deal with cross-device.
Yeah.
Right? People are getting more and more devices that now have a smartphone, tablet, PC, right? And then cycle those every 2 years.
Yeah.
And so, there's a lot of work being done, especially on the advertising side, around cross-device identification and things like that. But ultimately, it's a tough problem that I'm not sure has been solved in a meaningful way yet.
Yeah.
Unless you're Facebook and you have login for 1.4 billion people.
Unless you're Facebook and you have login, which has its own set of problems.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I guess the big issue around cross-device stuff, which will probably never be solved truly, is when someone switches from iOS to Android or Android to iOS, right?
Yeah.
Like, how do you, unless you build your own
Yeah.
verification system or use email or something like that, it's going to be hard.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
So another data point we're going to bring up is around China. So let's talk about China. It's huge, obviously, right? Like big deal. But when you look at this, what do you think, Ian?
So, like the scale of their market is just incredible, right? It is, to me, it is like China is essentially the equivalent of a sunken ship with treasure under it. Right? Like, incredibly hard to get to, incredibly hard to find, but if you can find it and if you can nail it, massive opportunity, right? And there's only a few companies who have done it. Like the Uber example, just raising $1 billion and saying it's essentially, majority of it at least is earmarked for China expansion. That's a crazy amount of money going into that economy that ultimately I think is going to be a big part of Uber's success or potential failure. I would guess success, but that's going to be a hard road to go down.
Yeah.
What about you, Rand?
It's amazing, and I don't really know what to think. I really like Ian's analogy, other than I think everyone knows the treasure and the ship are there, right? And it's like, if only you can figure out how to fight through the typhoon and then the sharks and the 10,000 feet of water, can you get there, right? And you have to kind of find somebody that knows what they're doing. I mean, there's long been, especially at least in games, like people who are promised to take your content east or west, right? And those things generally fail. So I think if you're going to think about China, it can't be a tertiary or secondary strategy to your business. You almost have to make it like a core focus, because it's, at least from a content perspective, right? Because the content just doesn't translate. So you either have to do Chinese content or not, right? So I think it's going to be hard. So, but I think it's clear that there's a huge opportunity, especially as more and more people come online. Because as you can see, like there's over 1 billion people in China, as far as I know. Is that right? So that means only half.
Right. I think that's what's really interesting is the comparison is Chinese mobile internet users versus the entire population.
Yeah, where's the population here? Right? And what's that look like?
Yeah.
Especially when you talk about the rural China, et cetera. I believe that it's in here or somewhere else in here that something like there are some astronomical number of cities in China with 1 million people, and there's only like 10 in the U.S. or something. It's like 85 or 90, and 10 in the U.S. Like it's just so big. Of course, on the other side of that, there's also just poverty. Like we can't comprehend it.
Right.
So,
all right, and then the last thing is talking about some App Store statistics.
you didn't want to throw in a stop blocking us.
I didn't want to talk about that.
China, if you're listening, stop blocking us. I know you're listening, China.
So, App Store statistics, in particular, some interesting data that seems to indicate that iOS growth is slowing, right? Not that it's not growing or it's shrinking, but that the growth rate itself is slowing. And at the same time that we're seeing this, and I think this dovetails with the China data, we're seeing pretty steady, strong growth for the Android ecosystem. But we also know that Android in China is not the same as Android in the US, so there's a lot of details to parse around this. But I think overall, what we're seeing is that Android becomes more and more important as China becomes more and more important, and companies like Xiaomi can really start to actually develop and be really meaningful just in China.
Yeah.
What else do you take away from this?
Well, So I think it was somewhat inevitable that Android would at least catch up some of the way in terms of revenue, just because of the sheer volume of users. I think the more concerning part that I have, if I'm Apple and iOS developers, is just kind of the lack of fluidity between amongst the apps that are really making meaningful revenue. So if you look at the charts, it's the same guys that have been there for the last 2 years. And if you look at like App Annie, which is now directionally accurate, right? Their revenue's been relatively stagnant. Kind of goes like this, but it's not going up. And I wonder how much of that is just due to the fact that they're always at the top. And it's hard for anybody to get traction because they're already at the top, and some people are kind of just like, I don't want to spend more money on this. So it's not a very well formulated thought, but that lack of movement amongst the top grossing and kind of the top apps is concerning.
Yeah, so I think there's a piece of that I agree with. The piece that is in here that is dropped is essentially this is in-app purchases and in-app purchases alone, right?
Yeah.
For the most part, paid apps are kind of dead.
Yeah.
And then advertising isn't going to be in here, and any sort of commerce outside, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's where we're seeing the biggest growth right now, and I would actually
Really
love to see what this graph looks like if you add in sort of that external commerce that's happening.
Yeah.
My guess is that iOS is still winning on that.
Yeah.
Right.
By a long shot.
Yeah, and I think that is always, for all of you out there who come across these data points and these charts and these graphs, like the one caveat is always, when you look at details around App Store revenue, it is very, very rare. I've yet to see anybody consistently do it where they talk about all of the App Store revenue associated with things like Uber payments, Lyft payments, Starbucks purchases of coffee. That stuff is not in these measurements. And that stuff is probably 5 to 10x the volume of this. And when we think about it and where we see probably data from our customers and people in the ecosystem, iOS continues to really lead the way there. So that's
e-commerce, Amazon purchases.
Yeah.
All left out of this.
Yeah.
Right? So, but still, I think the trend is interesting and continues to underline something we've said for a long time, which is fine, lead with iOS, but if you're really going for a global business, if you're really looking for universal appeal, you have to be on both, and you have to do a good job on both. And for many reasons, your company might actually decide to emphasize Google over iOS over time.
Yeah. And I, there was a point in time where I would have said, you should absolutely start with iOS, and there's no questions about it. I would almost now say you might be better off starting with Android, and for two really specific reasons. One, you can get content out and iterate faster than you can on iOS. And two, the cost of user acquisition is so much lower.
Yeah.
User acquisition costs in a shocking development on iOS have continued. They're just like super high.
So that's probably our next video is let's just check in.
We haven't talked about it in a while.
How high is it now? Is it $4? So.
Yeah, so I wouldn't be. There's still issues with Android and going there first, but if you're trying to iterate really quickly when you're a startup, I would think Android is a really good opportunity for you. Yeah, and maybe a good place to start.
Yep. So I think that wraps up some data, some interesting stuff from Ben Evans. We'll put some links in these posts that go up, and be sure to like the video, share it with your friends, and check out the other segment which was on this year's WWDC and Google I/O. Thanks again.
Thank you. Well, that was really good. This was.
Yeah, I actually.